Hey, Eliza,
Yeah?
can I ask you a question?
Sure. I'm okay with any question.
Okay. Who do you turn to if you need to talk about your feelings?
Your parents?
Yeah.
And your teacher?
Yeah.
Anyone you can trust.
Yeah, anyone you can trust. How do you know if you trust a person or not?
If they're a person you know and they know how to fix it and they're adults.
Is there someone at school you talk to about your feelings?
The teacher, or if they're really bad at a teacher can solve, maybe the principal. Dun, dun, dun.
Dun, dun, dun. Those are all very good options. I think it's important to have someone you can talk to. And if you can't always talk to me or you can't always talk to Dad, there are lots of other people that you can talk to.
Yeah.
Okay, I just want you to know that I will always be here for you to talk to.
I would always be there for you.
Oh, I love you. Welcome to the Get in My Head podcast. I am your host, SM Holland, and today we are going to be talking to my sweet, adorable, red panda loving friend, Beth. She has experience working in the mental health field with teens, and I'm excited to get her perspective and some stories about her working in this field. So often people working in the mental health field are overlooked because all the focus is put on the person with the mental illness or the mental health problems. And I'm excited to get an outside perspective. Without further ado, enjoy. Hey, Beth.
Hi.
So tell me a little bit about what you did in the behavioral, what is that called?
So there was, for a while, I was working at in behavioral treatment as a residential facility. So what that means is the kids would come live there for a while, and it was more than probably what a group home would look like, because they had like property, and they had two dorms, and there was a girls' dorm and a boys' dorm. So they had both, but they were separate, and they were cared for separately. And then the behavioral treatment part of it was just that they focused on behavioral therapy. Specifically, they focused on dialectical behavioral therapy. It's a certain therapy. I forget the name of the lady who developed it, but she was actually, which is interesting, was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. She came up with this therapy because she found it helpful for herself. So a lot of our kids did have borderline personality disorder, but even those who didn't, I think they found it helpful to kind of change some of the patterns and habits in their lives, and even just the way they communicated with people in their lives, like their family. So that was brief summary of what that was.
Can you give an example of what a session with that type of therapy would look like?
Yeah, so they would go through the whole thing in about 6 months, and the kids were slotted to stay there for about a year. So then every kid would go through it about twice, which was helpful for them to remember and review. And so the session, there were different topics. They'd look at interpersonal communication, and emotional regulation was a big one. So basically learning more about themselves and also how to communicate their needs to other people, which I really valued. I thought was a super valuable part of it. We would go in with our group, and the groups were probably about 7 or 8, so they weren't super big. And the counselor they had a handbook. The counselor would usually do a bit of a presentation of videos or multimedia stuff, but then they'd also do discussion and talk. And then for homework, the girls would have to take some of that and kind of come up with their own examples, or sometimes they'd come up with skits to help like explain and to help put it in their own kind of context so that it made sense to them. It was interesting. I learned a lot.
Okay, so what type of kids were in these behavioral facilities? Was it like foster kids, or kids that were like, I'm acting up in school and at home, so they get kicked out, and thrown in there?
Yeah, I don't know that we ever had foster. We had basically, there was kind of a spectrum. They were teenagers, but some of them were court ordered, so they'd been getting into trouble, and it was kind of like a last resort before juvie. So the court would say you need to find somewhere to send your kid for help and treatment. Some of them had been to juvie, and some of them, their parents were just at their wits' end because basically, I mean, a lot of these kids had mental health issues and they're manifesting in behaviors that were out of control, and it was affecting their family, it was affecting their school. And so sometimes the parents would seek us out as a last ditch effort. Like, we don't know what to do. The kid's not responding. So, and then we had some from inner city. We had a couple from, more middle class who you can, so it was kind of a spectrum of what they needed, where they were at. But basically the common factor was they didn't know how to regulate their emotions. So they were making poor choices and acting out in ways that were harmful to themselves or to others.
Did you find the facility helpful? Did it seem like it was helping the kids while they're there for long term, or did you see a lot of kids coming in and out?
I think it's a bit of a yes and no question. I think there was a lot of things that they did really, really right. It was hard. There was a good sense in that these kids are taken out of their usual context because it kind of helped them to relook at things. But then it was also really hard for them, and sometimes, especially at the beginning, made them resistant, which it would be hard to be separated from family and friends and normal. And what I saw even while I was there, but I think more some of the staff who'd been around longer talked a lot about, it was kind of a long-term, what they would see from the alumni would be some of what they learned there, they wouldn't actually start applying in their lives till down the road, 5 years maybe. A lot of kids would get out and then just kind of rebel and do whatever they wanted because they're like, we're free, we could. But then issues would start coming up in their life again, and they'd have different tools to deal with them. And then a lot of them would call back and be like, hey, for advice, and be like, hey, this is what's going on. I know you taught me, that I should do this and that. And they talk through it with us. And I think it makes sense because by that time they're getting a bit older too. And I think their brains are developing a bit more just because they're starting to become adults, typically about 5 years after we let them go. And I think that's when the multiple pieces for a lot of them would click together and they'd be able to apply what they learned and make choices. But it was definitely, it could be pretty hard on some of them, and some of them took it better than others. But regardless, I think they did a really great job of just how they cared for the kids while they were with us.
Now, for you as a worker, how did working there affect you and your mental health and your ability to just cope with life? Because that would be emotionally draining and difficult to go into that situation day after day, not knowing, is it going to be a good day? Is it going to be a bad day? Is some kid going to spit on me today? Is it going to end in hugs and butterflies?
Yeah, it was pretty consistently exhausting, I think. And even the shifts that we would do were, I don't know what you call them, but it wasn't regular 8-hour shifts. We would be on for 3 or 4 12-hour shifts. So then we'd go with the girls throughout the day, more nursing kind of shifts. So they were very long days, and then you'd get a bit of a break. But I think it's just because you get so emotionally invested, and sometimes at the beginning it was easier to detach and to go home and not be thinking about the girls and what they're struggling with. But once you start to get to know them and you hear their stories and what's going on in their lives, for me, especially because I'm an empathetic person, I cared for each of those girls so much. And so I did take it home with me a lot, and it was hard to detach. And with so many there at the same time, it was pretty much somebody was having a bad day every day. One of them was an emotional breakdown of some sort. Yeah, it was pretty exhausting.
So working there, like how has that changed your outlook on life and mental health and how you see people who are struggling?
I think one of the biggest things is it's taught me how to talk to people, kind of talk to anybody, but especially those who are struggling. And I think it's so easy to try to lend help and comfort from our own experience, but so many times that's not helpful. So there is, I wanted to be kind of careless and with what I said in the past. You know what I mean? I feel like I always had good intentions of, I want to be helpful, so I'm going to say these things. But you know how these words come out of your mouth sometimes that are just not helpful. And I think what it really showed me was what's going on the inside a lot of the time, and what things you can say to help let them explain what's happening instead of putting words in their mouth. Things like that, that really help you to just be a kind listener, and instead of someone who's like trying to fix things or trying to explain what the problem is from the outside. So I appreciate that. I think it's also, what I found working there was it helped me understand a lot of things in my life too, in areas where I need growth and healing, from my own experiences, and you know what I mean? So I think it really helped me in a personal sense in that too. And then to just extend that and realize, one of the things they emphasized a lot was all behaviors of communication, and I think it's so easy to judge people by their behavior, especially when it doesn't look normative, whatever that means, and to just make assumptions. But to just change that mindset of, they're acting this way for a reason, and to try to understand, okay, what's going on, and to then you can, I think, just be more helpful rather than hurtful.
Yeah, I think that's good advice for most areas of life for people, mental illness or not, because usually when people are acting a certain way, whether they're happy, content, angry, upset, there's a reason for it. And I think it's wiser to sit back and gauge them before you open your mouth and attack. I need to remember that sometimes.
Yeah, I think especially because it's like the average person, we're not doctors or psychiatrists or psychologists. So, and sometimes behaviors of people who have just had life circumstances that have been difficult can look like mental illness. And it's, okay, so how do I know which is which? And it's like, does it really matter? The way you treat them can be the same, because they have issues they need to work through, whether it's actually a physical imbalance or whether it's an emotional imbalance. They're both valid and they're both important. And so I think that's been a big thing too for me that I've learned, is to recognize that I don't need to have a diagnosis or a label on somebody to treat them with that same respect and kindness and patience that I would if I knew they had some serious, mental illness.
Yeah.
So
that's so true. That's so true. I have goosebumps just thinking about that. But yeah, I was reminded just recently about my own judgment towards people in this area and stuff, because the area of mental health right now, it's also a very big fad. To have some sort of mental illness or to claim a mental illness, and as someone who has struggled with their mental health, it almost frustrates me when someone walks around and says, well, I have anxiety, when really they don't. It's just nervous, or they just gave themselves a label to make themselves feel better or unique or whatever. But either way, it's still not my place to judge, for what degree of struggle that they have, because maybe they really don't have anxiety. Maybe it's masking some other struggle, but a struggle is a struggle is a struggle is a struggle.
And that's what I found so many times. Because some of our girls would come in and they were struggling behaviorally, but didn't have significant mental health issues, and some did, but that's something I learned. I think that just blazed on my brain was when I would see these kind of symptomatic surface things that at the beginning, so many times I'd be like, why are you acting like this? This isn't a big deal. Or you don't really have anxiety. And then finding out what was underneath. And there was almost always something that was underneath that was like, oh, okay, that's why. And it didn't manifest, like it almost never manifests the way you'd think. I think it really completely just kind of changed the way and sobered me up to not jumping to judgment or thinking I know the whole story.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, and it is interesting, like, you know, depending on your life circumstances or how you were raised or your chemicals in your brain, your genetic makeup, you know, depending on, you know, it could be the same circumstance across the board for every single person, but every single person is going to react in a different way. And I think that's a good reminder as people like walk through this planet, you know, with other humans. Don't judge. So would you, like, in the future ever see yourself working in this type of environment again?
Maybe. I think it's a hard question. I think it would be very important to me, like where it was and how they operated and who the staff was. I think those are super important. So I think it's definitely not out of the question. I think I do have a big heart for, I mean, people who are hurting anywhere. But, I mean, the fact that I spent so much time investing and learning about it, to me, it's like now I have a skill set. And even though it was hard for me at times, people said I was really good at it, you know, and I do care I cared about the girls a lot. So I think it would have to depend on where I was at and where I was working and how they operated and stuff like that would be super important to me. But also if I had a really good support system in place, because that's also a key for me. I know that if I were to do it again, I would need to have a good support system in place to keep me in a good place.
Definitely. If there is one thing you could change about the facility that you worked in, so the outcome of whatever would be better, what would you change?
Like, I know why this existed, but it was hard for them to get staff sometimes. And so sometimes I think they would bring people on who weren't the best fit, and they would work with them and train them, and so, but at times I was like, I think there would be a better candidate, because there would just be some staff just really struggled. I mean, most of the kids who came in had authority issues anyway. And there were some staff who would just seem to escalate kids a lot. So I think, I mean, for me, if I could change one thing, it would be to be able to bring on more qualified staff, or at least be a bit more choosy in who they would bring on, because I think it would help. So
yeah, I mean, that's understandable. And it's so hard to keep staff in places like that. Because where I worked before, like, the turnover was so high because it's such, not only is it physically demanding, it's very emotionally demanding. So, and people get in it because they're like, oh my gosh, I'm going to make $15 an hour. And then they get there and they're like, this is not worth it.
Yeah, I definitely understand why. I mean, I didn't stay for super long either. So I think, but in an ideal world, yeah.
So, okay, in your personal opinion, what can we, as a society, as adults, as humans, do better to help specifically kids and young adults who are struggling, whether they have a mental illness or they're just like going through a really hard time in their life at that moment? Like, what can we do? Because a lot of times adults will look at kids who are acting out and struggling and just tell them, you know, knock it off, as opposed to trying to get to the root of the problem. Like, what would your advice be for someone who is on the outside looking in?
It's a tough question. I think recently I was reading this book. It was really interesting. It was talking about how there's just so much less stability in general for these next generations coming up. There used to be much more of a unity and more of like a common narrative, between parents and school and the media, and or if you attended a religious institution. Like there was much more of a support system and a common kind of narrative, and how a lot of that has fractured. And now kids are hearing different things from school and the media and parents, and they're kind of making their own narrative and worldview. They're piecing together things that make sense to them, and it looks chaotic. And so I think, family is super important. I think the family unit is so important, and families need support, whether that's parents getting more informed about things like this and just kind of like what we talked about, how to talk through things and how to recognize when their kid is struggling, even how to approach it and what might be under the surface. I think there's some great information in classes, and just spending time with them. But I think just this patience and understanding is so huge. I think whether you're the kid or the parent or a relative, it's so easy to jump to judgment and conclusions instead of trying to ask questions and understand what's actually going on. Whether you are directly involved in that situation or a parent or a relative or a friend, or even just, I guess, a stranger, and you run into some kid or a difficult situation, to just be patient and understanding, to try to ask questions instead of jumping to conclusions, because I think we make the problem worse a lot of the time, by trying to fit things into a certain mold and trying to compare the world to what it was 20 years ago, because it's not. There's so many stressors out there right now, and kids are anxious, adults are anxious and freaking out and tired and scared, and it drips down to the kids, and the kids are growing up like that. And how scary is it to see the adults in your life scared and anxious and frustrated? And I think if there's already a mental illness there, it's going to compound it and make it that much worse if there's not safety, So I think recognizing
that's so true, and that's a huge reason why mental illness is on the rise today, because what people don't understand about mental illness is that a lot of it, there are genetic factors, and you could be walking around with, for example, like the OCD gene, and not have any traumatic experience in your life, not have like tons of stressors in your life, and you can go through your life without, activating that gene and never experience OCD. Or you can go through your life and go through a traumatic experience with something like a car accident, or you mentioned the constant stress in today's world, and it'll turn it on. And now you have this serious mental illness. Stress is such like a huge determining factor for health problems, not just mental, physical and spiritual and everything above.
It's so true. And I think most of the girls we got, there's so many things I'd see in them that be like, oh, I've seen that in other people. But sometimes the differentiating factor would be like, oh, this happened to them, or, somebody did this to them. There would be something, the way they were treated, or things would happen that would be out of their control. Like this one girl, her mom was diagnosed with like brain cancer. And to her, that was like the tipping factor, like to walk through all that and to fear that her mom was going to die. She didn't know how to deal with that. And it's like you put that on top of everything else, and the dad doesn't necessarily have time to sit down and walk her through what that means. And if you don't have support there with other family, then she is going to try to figure out how to cope and how to deal with it on her own. And if she goes and starts abusing alcohol and drugs, and there is a mental illness there, that's going to make things worse and going to get her body all out of whack. And so there's this trigger effect, and there's this way that like an avalanche that it builds up if things aren't dealt with properly, and then it's going to explode in the end. And so I think I mean, there's no easy answer, but recognizing, again, just the huge stress that is in society today. And again, that even the smallest behaviors, instead of looking at them like, this is bad behavior, why are they behaving badly? To recognize this communication, like, oh, why did they need to yell to feel like they had to be heard? Like, am I not listening to them? You know what I mean? Or to ask what's behind it. So, and I know
That's
it's hard.
So relatable.
Yeah, you know all about that.
Yes. I think you like triggered a tear with that last comment, actually.
It is. I mean, I'm an adult, and I feel that way sometimes too. Like that, I have to act out to get my needs met, and I'm an adult who, you know what I mean. And so these kids who, if they don't know how to communicate their needs, which adults need to teach them that, then they're gonna act out in these ways, and especially if they have some sort of mental illness. And I mean, it's so hard, but just, I think the humility to stop trying to frame things in a way that, this equals this, because there's such a spectrum. And like you talked about, the same 5 people could go through the same 5 circumstances, but it's going to affect them all very differently. And so I think that's something I used to struggle with, was like, oh, you've been through that, but that's not as bad as this, so why are you struggling? You know what I mean? Like, it's so easy to quantify experiences.
I got that a lot, growing up. Like, why are you reacting like that? Why are you... Turns out I'm bipolar, so there are reasons why I was acting the way I was acting that were out of my control that I didn't even understand. So I didn't even have the tools to be able to explain it to somebody else, why I was acting the way I was acting. I think just kind words and compassion go very far.
It's true. And I think if you've never been in that position, it's hard to understand how scary all those emotions can be, and how scary it is to not understand. Even like for these kids, a lot of them are terrified because they don't understand either, And I think, just that compassion to say, regardless of whether I think this is a valid pain or not, it's like, no, they're not, this is legitimate. And if they're in pain, they're in pain. If they're afraid, they're afraid. And I don't think we need to quantify that. I think we need to love them through it and to be patient with them. We don't need to, even if we think, we don't need to judge people if we think they're weaker than us. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's important to remember, that someone else's feelings are valid and important, whether or not you understand why they have those feelings or emotions. Like, they don't have to make sense to you. It's not your job to understand,
Yeah.
It's your job to just take a step back and be like, either back away completely if you have no idea what you're doing, or be like, how can I help you?
Yeah. And on the flip side, in an encouraging note, when you do that, you don't have to have degrees, and you don't have to have, all this know-how. Just when you're kind and patient and not judgmental, it does so much. Just that little bit of compassion to say, like, oh, I see you're struggling, and I'm not going to judge you for that. It really helps so much to heal wounds and to make that person feel like they're heard and they're seen. Compassion and kindness.
Before we wrap up here, what are the top 5 things that you do to help protect your mental health?
Oh man, top 5.
Put you
That's
on the
tough.
spot.
I know. I think
that wasn't even in the list of questions.
Wasn't in the list of questions.
I'm sorry.
I'll list a few. We'll see if I can get to 5. If not, you're just gonna have to be okay with it.
I can live with that.
I have people in my life who I know aren't going to judge me for working through, my emotional stress or whatever's going on, who I can talk to, that I have to I think, consistently reach out to sometimes, but is super important for me is one. And it's been hard to find those people sometimes, and I think sometimes the list of who it is can change depending on circumstances, but having that support system, even to just be able to vent or talk through my feelings and what's going on, is super helpful. I tend to be a journaler. I like to journal out, even if it doesn't make sense, to just kind of journal out and put my thoughts and feelings and struggles into words. Once in a while, it kind of comes out as poetry, but I think for me, it's just helpful to process, to get it on the page and to kind of look at it and reread it. So what's going on? I do protect my alone time too. So my room, I've been kind of traveling a lot, so it hasn't been this, but my room's very much a safe place. So I think being able to have my own space and shut out stress or cares or responsibilities and have a quiet place, for me, it's important. Music is a big one too for me that helps me regulate my emotions. Because, again, my emotions don't always make sense to me. Or sometimes you just have to ride them out because they're just so strong for one reason or another. And music helps me kind of moderate them and get to a place where I can think clearly again and think through and sort things out. So I don't know if that was 4, but I guess those are some.
That was 4.
That was 4. I need one more. I do. I guess, yeah, I write fiction. And to me, that's a huge one because it helps me it's just the way my mind works. And I know a lot of creative people would say this about their art form. It's a huge emotional outlet. It helps me to make sense of painful things that have happened to me, to play out these characters' lives and what happens to them and how they respond. And it's also super therapeutic. And I know it doesn't make sense to a lot of people. Some people totally understand that and other people don't, but it just really is. It helps to make sense of the mess and the jumble sometimes and to kind of de-stress. And there's 5. You got 5.
Good job.
Yeah.
You get a gold star.
Oh, thank you so much.
I know some of y'all are really struggling right now, and if not you, you know somebody who is. If you need help, please check out my website, smholland.com. There you'll find a list of help hotlines where you can call or email or text to be able to talk to somebody if you need help. Remember, you're loved so much, and your life is a life worth saving. Thank you so much for tuning in and helping me break down the stigma surrounding mental illness. Until next time, just keep moving forward. I love y'all. Bye.